Hey FLL coaches, this is Jeremy here with another quick video on how to best organize your code so that your code not only makes sense when you build it the first time, but also when you come back to it, you can also find what you need. This is also a good organization strategy for students who might be passing along their code to a different student so that they can understand which each chunk of coding blocks does. Now, if you look at my code here, let me just replace when program starts. When you look at my code here, it's a very long chain of code right now. And maybe when you build it, it makes a lot of sense, but when you come back to it 2 weeks later, it might be really hard to see what each chunk of code does. So what we want to go for is modularization here. Each chunk of code has a clear label so that you can tell what it does. And there are two ways that I like to do that. One is using the broadcast feature. So if you scroll through your coding blocks to events here, you'll see that there's a broadcast message and a when I receive message. Now we can make these messages whatever we want. Essentially, it allows one chunk of code to start another chunk of code. And I'll show you how that can be useful. So I'm going to rename these messages. I'm going to make 3 messages, one for the start and line following code, one for the turnaround code in my challenge, and one for the go home code. You can add more, but that's what my code does right now. It drives to the end of the table, it turns around, and it comes back. So I'm going to call the first one line following. And instead of when program starts, I'm actually going to get rid of that. And I'm going to grab a when I receive line following. And I'm going to actually start my code somewhere different. So I'm going to broadcast line following when the program starts. So when the program starts, this will trigger this first chunk of code. Now, this is when I want to stop line following. After the turner equals 3, I'm going to stop moving. So this is where I'm going to add my next broadcast. I've line followed, I'm to the end of the table. This chunk of code should be over. And so at the very end of the code, I want to trigger the new chunk of code to start. I'm going to make a new message. We're going to call it turnaround. And then this is the next chunk of code that I want to get triggered. This is my turn until my yaw angle equals 175. And out of 360 degrees, 175 is about a half turn, right? So in order for that chunk of code to get triggered, I'm going to add a when I receive, and I'm going to change the message to turn around. When I receive, turn around, then I'll turn around. So each module of our code, each chunk of code is triggering the next chunk. So when I receive turnaround. And this is a great way to just add labels to the top of each code so you can quickly tell which chunk of code does what. Right now, my code isn't that complicated. I only have 3 things happening. But if your code has 6, 7, even 10 things happening, it can be really helpful to have these different modules. The last thing I need to do, I'm looking at my code again, stop moving, I'm pulling this off. So this is the turnaround part. The last thing I need to do is the go home part. Now this chunk of code, oh, that's not right. This chunk of code says, once I've turned around, drive at 15 degrees forever, right? Or until I get to the home base and, the students can pick me up. And so I'm just gonna do the exact same thing, add a new broadcast here, new message. We're going to call it go home. And when I receive go home. All right, so that's one way that you can organize your code. The next way that you can organize your code is by using the myBlocks function. Now, quick disclaimer, myBlocks can be used for a lot of different things. We're going to be using it for its most simple function here, to label code and modularize it so that we can clearly see which chunk does what. So I'm going to go to myBlocks, and I'm going to make 3 different blocks, similar to my broadcasts. One's going to be line follower, one's going to be go home, and one is going to be turn. All right, once you've created those 3 my blocks, you'll see that it's asking you up here to define what each one means. So essentially what's happening is we can stick a whole chunk of code, for example, this is the line follower, onto line follower. And now every time we want to use a line follower in our code, instead of building all of these blocks over again, we simply need to go to my block and grab the line follow function and pull it down here. So line follow represents, it's like a variable that represents all these different blocks. It essentially saves time and condenses things so that they're easier to read. We can define turn up here. So I'm going to grab my chunk of blocks that allow me to turn 180 degrees. So we'll add a turn right there. And then finally, I'm already disorganizing all these. Finally, we'll drag the go home function up here. So define line, turn, and go home. And I'm just going to organize those left to right. Line follow, turn, go home. And let me zoom up for you a little bit just so you can see that better. All right, wonderful. Now we're not quite done yet because something needs to start all of that code. So all we need to do is when program starts, we drag a line follow down here. Then if we want to turn next, we grab turn, and then we grab go home because that is our sequence. There's a lot more that you can do with my blocks. This is just the very simplest way of using a my block. Another thing to note is if you're doing multiple missions in one run and you need to line follow a certain amount, or you need to line follow several times or turn several times, you can edit them just right so that, you know, if after I go home I need to line follow, you can just grab another line follow. Or if you want to do something custom between those two blocks, you could always build that function into your sequence of events. So for example, if between the go home and the line follow I want to smile, I can always drag that in there. Wonderful. Well, thank you all for watching. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. Happy building.